The most dangerous myth about the Amish is not that they are backward, it is that they are harmless. That myth collapses the moment you listen closely to survivors who were raised inside plain communities and later escaped them. People who describe rituals not of Satan worship, but of silence, coercion, symbolic punishment, and spiritual theater so extreme that outsiders mistake it for something occult. What they encountered was not pentagrams or altars, but a closed moral system where suffering is ritualized, secrecy is sacred, and obedience is enforced with a precision that feels to those trapped inside it, indistinguishable from something demonic. This is not a story about devil worship in the cinematic sense. It is a story about how certain accusations of satanic rituals arise inside Amish communities, and why those accusations persist. To understand that, you must understand the machinery of Amish life itself. Every Amish community is governed by an ordnung. It is not written down. It is not debated in public. It is memorized, absorbed, and enforced collectively. The ordnung dictates what you wear, how your clothing fastens, whether your bonnet strings are tied or pinned, whether buttons are permitted or replaced with hooks and eyes. These details are not aesthetic, they are moral boundaries. To violate them is to signal rebellion, not just against the church, but against God. Worship is conducted without instruments. Hymns from the Ausbund are sung slowly, drawn out over long, unbroken lines, sometimes lasting 20 minutes per verse. The effect is hypnotic. The language is High German, which many children do not fully understand. This is not accidental. The Ausbund is not merely a hymnal, it is a technology of endurance, forged in Anabaptist prisons where suffering itself became proof of faithfulness. From childhood, Amish members are taught that submission, Gelassenheit, is the highest virtue. To submit is to survive. To resist is to be cut off. And that cutting off has a name, Meidung, shunning. Shunning is not a single act. It is a protocol. It begins with silence, escalates to exclusion from meals, and ends with total social erasure. You may still live in the same house as your family, but they will not eat with you. They will not acknowledge your presence. For a child or young woman, this is psychological annihilation. Survivors describe it as being alive while already buried. It is within this environment that accusations of rituals emerge. Former members describe repeated, highly structured events where abuse, confession, forgiveness, and enforced reconciliation follow an almost liturgical sequence. A victim reports harm. The bishop convenes a meeting. The perpetrator confesses publicly. The community prays. Forgiveness is declared mandatory. The victim is instructed to accept it. If she hesitates, if she expresses fear, anger, or refusal, she becomes the transgressor. This cycle repeats over and over, always the same steps, always the same outcome. To an outsider, especially a traumatized child, this repetition can feel ritualistic. The language used, talk of sin entering the body, of temptation working through flesh, of obedience restoring purity, can sound indistinguishable from exorcism narratives found in other high-control religious groups. Some survivors describe being forced to kneel while elders pray over them, rebuking rebellion, commanding submission, insisting that resistance itself is evidence of spiritual corruption. Others recount being taken to isolated homes, barns, or back rooms for counseling, where prayers are spoken aloud while physical punishment is administered. The prayers are not improvised. They are inherited phrases, passed down, rarely questioned. Is this Satanism? No, not doctrinally, but it is ritualized harm. And here is where the misunderstanding hardens into something darker. Within Amish culture, there exists a long-standing folk tradition known as brasherai, or powwowing. It is a form of Christian folk healing that uses spoken Bible verses, gestures, and symbolic acts to ward off illness or misfortune. Officially, many Amish bishops condemn it. Unofficially, it persists in pockets, passed quietly between families. To outsiders, and sometimes to insiders, powwowing looks like spell work, words spoken over bodies, objects buried or burned, illness transferred symbolically from person to animal or land. When abuse victims, already conditioned to fear spiritual contamination, encounter these practices, the line between folk Christianity and perceived witchcraft collapses. Survivors have described elders warning them that disobedience invites dark spirits. Others recall being told that reporting abuse would allow Satan to enter the community, bringing punishment upon innocent families. In this moral universe, evil is not external. It is contagious. One former Amish woman described being locked in a room while elders prayed loudly outside, instructing her to repent for tempting men by existing. Another recalled being told that her nightmares were proof of demonic influence rather than trauma. In these moments, the language of sin becomes the language of possession. And this is the critical point. When survivors later try to explain what happened to them, especially to police, therapists, or journalists who lack cultural context, they reach for the closest available vocabulary: ritual, ceremony, chanting, punishment, silence, fear, severe, satanic. The phrase becomes a container for experiences that defy ordinary description. There is a historical precedent for this. During the Satanic Panic of the 1980s, closed religious and educational environments were scrutinized through a lens of ritual abuse. Many accusations were later discredited, but the underlying dynamics, authoritarian control, coerced confession, enforced silence, were real. The panic did not invent harm, it misnamed it. Inside Amish communities, the misnaming runs in both directions. Some bishops genuinely fear that external influence, law enforcement, social services, secular therapy, is satanic by definition. To them, the outside world is the adversary. Reporting abuse is not justice, it is betrayal. This belief is reinforced weekly, monthly, yearly, through sermons and communal decisions made behind closed doors. Decisions outsiders never see. One survivor described a council meeting where elders debated whether a teenage girl's assault should be treated as sin or temptation. The discussion lasted hours. The girl was not present. When the decision was announced, it was framed as God's will. No appeal was permitted. This is the hidden friction of plain life. The friction between appearance and enforcement, between humility and control, between forgiveness and impunity. The Amish do not need satanic rituals to destroy dissent. They have something far more efficient, a system where morality is communal property and individuality is treated as a spiritual threat. And yet there are cases where accusations go further, where families accuse one another of literal devil worship, curses, or demonic influence. These cases almost always arise during internal conflict, inheritance disputes, custody battles, attempts to leave the community. In such moments, the language of Satan becomes a weapon. Once that accusation is spoken aloud, it cannot be unsaid. To be labeled spiritually corrupt is to be socially dead. But the real reason these accusations surface is not what it seems. It is rooted in a decision made behind closed doors, a decision about who controls truth, suffering, and forgiveness inside the community. And once that decision is made, every act of resistance can be reframed as evil itself. In the next segment, we will follow one survivor's account step by step, not to sensationalize it, but to dissect how ordinary religious mechanisms can be experienced as something far more terrifying by those trapped inside them. What looks peaceful from the road does not always remain so once the doors are shut. The survivor did not use the word ritual at first. That language came later, after years of trying to explain what had happened in terms outsiders could grasp. She described patterns instead. Every Sunday followed the same rhythm. Worship in a neighbor's home, benches hauled in from wagons, men seated on one side, women on the other, children silent, eyes down, the singing slow enough to stretch time itself. Then the sermon, delivered by a bishop chosen not for theological training but for moral authority, authority that could not be appealed. After worship came the private reckonings. If a rule had been broken, it was never addressed casually. There were no informal warnings. Everything unfolded in stages. First, observation, then quiet discussion among elders, then a summons, always polite, always framed as care. Come talk with us. The room was small, no decorations, sometimes a kitchen table, sometimes a back room of a barn. The survivor remembered the stillness more than the words, the sense that something had already been decided before she entered. She was asked to confess, not to a specific act, but to a disposition, pride, resistance, a lack of submission. These were not behaviors, they were spiritual states, impossible to disprove. When she cried, she was told tears could be manipulative. When she stayed calm, she was told that calmness signaled hardness of heart. The elders prayed aloud while she sat in silence. Their prayers followed a familiar cadence. She later realized she had heard similar phrasing since childhood, woven into sermons and hymns. This was not spontaneous. It was inherited speech. At the end, forgiveness was pronounced, not offered, declared. She was expected to accept it immediately. Gratitude was the appropriate response. Relief. Anything else suggested rebellion. This is the structure that survivors describe again and again. A closed loop of accusation, confession, prayer, and enforced reconciliation. No witnesses from outside, no record, no deviation. For a child or adolescent, this can feel indistinguishable from a rite. The Amish insist that forgiveness is central to their faith, and they are correct. But forgiveness in this context is not an interior process. It is a public obligation. To withhold it is to disrupt communal harmony, and disruption is treated as a spiritual emergency. This is where fear enters the body. Survivors describe being told that unconfessed sin can bring calamity on the entire district. Crop failure, illness, accidents, stillbirths. In such a worldview, a single dissenting person becomes a liability to everyone else. Pressure does not need to be violent to be absolute. When abuse occurs, sexual, physical, or psychological, the same machinery activates. The harm itself is reframed as a test, a temptation, a lapse that can be resolved through repentance and forgiveness. Police are worldly. Courts are adversarial. To involve them is to invite Satan's influence into the church. These teachings are not abstract. They are repeated until they become reflex. One survivor recalled being warned that if she spoke to authorities, her younger siblings would suffer. Another was told that demons exploit division, and that reporting abuse would open a door that could not be closed. The language is strikingly consistent across regions and affiliations. This is not coincidence. It is doctrine filtered through fear. The Amish have no centralized hierarchy, but they share a theological DNA shaped by centuries of persecution. In Europe, Anabaptists were imprisoned, tortured, executed. Secrecy became survival. Outsiders were dangerous by definition. That historical memory still governs behavior, even when the threat no longer resembles the past. But trauma does not update itself automatically. In modern contexts, that inherited suspicion becomes something else, a shield for internal authority. When survivors attempt to leave, the pressure intensifies. Leaving is not merely departure. It is interpreted as rejection of God's order. Family members are instructed to withdraw contact. Meals are taken separately. Conversation stops. Even children are expected to comply. This is where the experience tips from coercion into something that feels supernatural. One former Amish man described walking past his mother in the same house and being treated as if invisible. Another described siblings refusing to acknowledge her existence while praying aloud for her soul. The prayers were not gentle. They were warnings disguised as concern. To someone raised to believe that community is salvation, this isolation feels like spiritual death. It is in this psychological terrain that claims of satanic activity sometimes arise, not because pentagrams are being drawn, but because the language used to enforce conformity borrows heavily from cosmological warfare. Light versus darkness, obedience versus corruption, inside versus outside. Once someone is cast as outside, anything can be attributed to them. In several documented cases, internal disputes escalated into accusations of demonic influence. A woman who challenged a bishop's decision was said to be under evil influence. A family seeking to leave was rumored to have invited darkness into their home. These accusations were never investigated. They did not need to be. Their function was social, not factual. To be labeled spiritually dangerous is to be neutralized. There are rare cases where this language takes on literal form, where children accuse relatives of impossible acts involving curses or possession. These cases often involve intense questioning by authority figures combined with religious imagery. The resulting stories mirror broader moral panics seen elsewhere in American history. What is crucial to understand is that these narratives do not emerge in a vacuum. They emerge in environments where obedience is prized above truth and where suffering is explained as spiritual necessity. The survivor eventually left with nothing but borrowed clothes and a phone number scribbled on paper. She had no birth certificate, no social security card, no education beyond 8th grade. She had been taught that the outside world was violent, sexual, and godless. When she finally spoke to a therapist, she struggled to describe what she had endured. "They prayed over me," she said. "They made me confess things I didn't do. They said I was dangerous." The therapist asked if it felt ritualistic. Only then did the words surface. This is the danger of sensational framing. When survivors reach for extreme language, it is often because ordinary language fails them. Their experiences do not map neatly onto secular categories of abuse. They occurred inside a moral system that sanctified control and dressed it in holiness. Calling it satanic is both inaccurate and revealing. Inaccurate because the Amish are theologically opposed to Satanism in every formal sense. Revealing because the mechanisms of harm, secrecy, fear, ritualized confession, enforced silence, are the same mechanisms that appear in groups universally recognized as destructive. The distinction matters. If the problem is framed as hidden devil worship, it becomes easy to dismiss. No evidence, no prosecutions, no accountability. If the problem is framed as systemic coercion rooted in religious authority, the conversation becomes far more uncomfortable. It implicates law, culture, and the limits of religious autonomy. Some Amish leaders have begun to acknowledge this tension quietly. Younger members question whether forgiveness without accountability is truly Christian. Advocacy groups formed by former Amish push for mandatory reporting laws and external oversight. These efforts are met with resistance, not because abuse is defended openly, but because exposure itself is feared. Fear has always been the regulating force. Fear of shunning, fear of damnation, fear of tearing the community apart, and fear, when ritualized, becomes something else entirely. In the next segment, we will examine how these internal systems collide with the outside world, courts, journalists, therapists, and why that collision often produces stories that sound unbelievable, exaggerated, or impossible, even when they are grounded in lived reality. Because the most forbidden truth of plain life is not that darkness exists there. It is that darkness can be sanctified. When survivors finally cross the boundary between plain life life and the outside world. The collision is rarely clean. It is not a rescue scene. It is disorientation. They arrive carrying a moral framework that no longer functions, speaking a language that does not translate, and describing experiences that sound implausible to anyone unfamiliar with. Closed religious systems. This is where disbelief enters and where stories begin to fracture. Courts ask for timelines. Survivors speak in cycles. Therapists ask for intent. Survivors describe obligation. Journalists ask for evidence. Survivors describe consensus. In Amish life, truth is not established through documentation. It is established through agreement among elders. When that agreement exists, it overrides individual testimony. When it does not, testimony dissolves into silence. This becomes devastating in legal contexts. Many survivors cannot produce dates, locations, or witnesses in ways the justice system requires. Abuse occurred repeatedly, in familiar spaces, without markers. There was no first time that stood out. There was no clear end. And because the harm was wrapped in prayer and forgiveness, it did not initially register as a crime. Several survivors have said the same thing in different words. They did not know they were allowed to call it abuse. By the time they understand that they can, statutes of limitation have often expired. This legal erasure fuels the language of ritual and conspiracy. When ordinary accountability fails, extraordinary explanations rush in to fill the vacuum. The mind searches for patterns that justify the scale of harm. This is how satanic narratives gain traction, not as belief systems, but as explanatory frameworks. In some cases, these narratives are reinforced by well-meaning outsiders, evangelical counselors unfamiliar with Amish culture may interpret powwowing, communal confession, or shunning through the lens of spiritual warfare. Media producers, hungry for clicks, collapse complex systems into shocking headlines. Amish satanic rituals is a phrase that travels faster than closed-loop moral enforcement in decentralized Anabaptist communities. But speed distorts truth. The Amish are not practicing Satanism. They are practicing something far older and harder to confront, a form of communal absolutism where dissent threatens survival and where suffering is transmuted into virtue. The danger of mislabeling this system is not just academic. It actively harms survivors. When their stories are framed as occult fantasy, credibility erodes. Defense attorneys point to moral panic. Bishops retreat further into secrecy. Communities close ranks. The cycle tightens. And yet, dismissing the language survivors use is also a mistake. When someone says it felt satanic, they are not making a theological claim. They are describing how power felt in their body. They are describing fear without escape, punishment without appeal, and authority without transparency. Those sensations are real. Consider the mechanics of shunning again. It is often described benignly as withdrawal. In practice, it is total social negation. You lose not only relationships, but identity. Your name stops being spoken. Your labor is no longer accepted. Your presence becomes contaminating. This is not metaphorical death. It is functional death. Anthropologists studying high control groups note that such practices trigger the same neurological responses as physical threat. Humans evolved to depend on social belonging for survival. When belonging is withdrawn, the body reacts as if facing extinction. Layer spiritual consequences onto that: eternal damnation, separation from God, and the fear becomes existential. Now imagine enduring this while being told it is an act of love. That contradiction fractures perception. Several survivors describe moments where prayer felt like assault, not because prayer is inherently violent, but because it was used to override consent, silence protest, and sanctify harm. When language that should offer comfort becomes an instrument of control, it warps meaning itself. This is why some survivors describe their experience as evil, even while rejecting the idea of literal demons. Evil, in this sense, is not a supernatural force. It is a relational one. It is what happens when systems prioritize order over humanity. The Amish system does this unintentionally but persistently. Its decentralization makes reform difficult. There is no central authority to appeal to. Each district governs itself. A bishop who mishandles abuse can simply retire quietly. A district that tolerates harm can continue unchanged for generations. Outsiders often ask why families do not intervene. The answer lies in mutual dependency. Everyone relies on everyone else for labor, childcare, economic survival. To challenge authority is to risk losing that network. Few are willing to gamble their children's future on moral principle alone. This creates a perverse incentive structure where silence is rewarded and speaking out is punished. Some survivors who leave are accused of exaggeration or fabrication. Others are accused of being influenced by Satan precisely because they adopt secular language of rights and autonomy. In that worldview, independence itself is suspect. The outside world becomes the adversary again, and yet change is occurring, slowly, unevenly, often invisibly. Advocacy groups formed by former Amish operate quietly, helping leavers obtain identification, education, and trauma-informed counseling. Some districts have begun cooperating cooperating with law enforcement in limited ways. Younger members question inherited practices, especially when they conflict with observable harm. But these shifts provoke backlash. Any attempt to introduce mandatory reporting laws is framed as persecution. Any media exposure is framed as exploitation. Any survivor who speaks publicly is accused of profiting from pain. The irony is profound. A community forged by persecution now fears scrutiny more than injustice. This fear fuels secrecy. Secrecy fuels speculation. Speculation fuels sensational claims. And those claims, in turn, reinforce the community's belief that outsiders cannot be trusted. It is a closed circuit. Breaking that circuit requires precision. It requires refusing both romanticization and demonization. It requires naming harm without inventing monsters. The Amish do not need to be portrayed as satanic to be held accountable. They need to be understood as human communities capable of both deep care and deep harm, shaped by history, theology, and fear. The survivors who use extreme language are not liars. They are translators, struggling to convey experiences forged in a moral universe most outsiders have never entered. If we listen carefully, without sensationalism, without dismissal, we begin to hear what they are actually saying. They are saying that peace can be enforced. They are saying that forgiveness can be weaponized. They are saying that holiness can be used to justify cruelty. And they are saying that when every avenue of appeal is closed, the mind reaches for the language of the forbidden to make sense of the unbearable. The final question is not whether the Amish are hiding satanic rituals. That question, dramatic as it sounds, misses the point entirely. The real question is, what happens when a society is structured in such a way that suffering can be explained away as virtue, dissent can be reclassified as corruption, and accountability can be treated as spiritual contamination? Because once that structure is in place, you no longer need darkness to be imported from outside. The system manufactures its own. Religious freedom has long protected Amish communities from external interference. That protection was earned through real historical persecution, and it deserves respect. But freedom was never meant to function as immunity. When autonomy becomes insulation, harm can persist without correction. The outside world struggles with this tension. Intervene too aggressively, and you confirm the Amish fear of persecution. Step back entirely, and you abandon the most vulnerable to a system that cannot protect them. Survivors exist in that gap. They are often told implicitly or explicitly that telling their stories threatens cultural survival, that speaking up will destroy families, fracture districts, and invite state control. The burden placed on them is extraordinary. Remain silent to preserve tradition, or speak and become the reason it falls apart. No child should carry that weight, yet many do. This is why the language of satanic ritual persists despite its inaccuracy. It is the language of desperation. It is what emerges when harm is systematic but unspeakable, when trauma is real but unacknowledged, when power is diffuse but absolute. It is easier to imagine a secret cult than to confront the idea that ordinary religious practices, confession, forgiveness, shunning, can become destructive when stripped of consent and accountability. Evil, in this context, is not theatrical. It is procedural. It is a meeting held without the accused present. It is forgiveness declared before safety is secured. It is prayer used to end a conversation rather than open one. It is a child taught that obedience matters more than truth. Understanding this does not require abandoning nuance. Amish life is not uniformly abusive. Many families are loving, stable, and sincere. Mutual aid is real. Community care is real. Faith is real. But so is harm. The danger lies in the refusal to hold both realities at once. When outsiders insist the Amish are purely peaceful, survivors are erased. When outsiders insist the Amish are secretly satanic, survivors are sensationalized and disbelieved. Both narratives serve the same function. They prevent meaningful engagement with the actual mechanisms of harm. What survivors need is not myth-making. It is clarity. They need systems that recognize how closed communities function, laws that mandate reporting without criminalizing belief, therapists trained to understand communal trauma rather than individual pathology alone, journalists willing to sit with complexity instead of chasing shock, and most of all, they need the freedom to speak without being turned into symbols. The Amish, too, deserve honesty. They deserve to be seen not as caricatures of purity or depravity, but as human societies grappling, often unsuccessfully, with the cost of preservation. Traditions survive only when they can adapt to protect life, not just order. There is a reason younger Amish members are asking harder questions, a reason some districts quietly cooperate with authorities, a reason advocacy groups exist at all. These are not signs of decay. They are signs of moral tension finally being acknowledged. If there is a forbidden truth at the heart of plain life, it is this: peace is not the absence of conflict. It is the presence of justice. Without justice, peace becomes silence, and silence, sustained long enough, begins to feel like something else entirely. So, when you hear a survivor survivor speak in extreme terms, resist the urge to correct them too quickly. Ask what conditions made that language necessary. Ask what failed them so completely that only the vocabulary of the forbidden felt adequate. Because the most unsettling revelation is not that evil hides in unlikely places. It is that it can wear the face of righteousness, sing in perfect harmony, and insist, calmly, patiently, that what you are experiencing is love. Seeing that clearly is not an attack on the Amish. It is an act of responsibility, and it is the only way forward.